Nicholas Carr, you have really shaken up things in the IT world. Your ideas have been called everything from genius to a hogwash and everything in between. How can you say IT is not strategic and that companies are actually wasting time on IT?
Well, I don't think I've said that companies are wasting time. If I did, I didn't mean it. But,
you take it back.
But I do think, and I have said that companies have wasted a lot of money on IT. Mm-hmm. I think if you look at the latest statistics, something like 50% of the IT capacity that companies have added in recent years is going unused completely. And about 75% of major IT projects fail to reach their goals. So obviously there's a lot of waste out there. And if you look at the reasons for that waste, I think a lot of it can be traced back to over-expectations about the strategic importance of IT. It's important to draw a distinction between an essential business resource and a strategic one, because they're not necessarily the same thing. There are plenty of business resources that are costs of doing business. You have no choice but to invest in them and maintain competitive parity, but they don't lead to the kind of competitive differentiation that in turn leads to strategic advantage and superior profitability. And I think IT fits into that category. And for a lot of companies, the danger is to continue to think that by being an IT innovator, you're going to get this lasting advantage or even a meaningful advantage. And that leads to overinvestment, too much risk-taking, and ultimately disappointment in IT investment.
Tell us a little bit more about the premise of your book. Surely you're not suggesting that all IT investments are worthless and that organizations around the world should have just stuck with calculators and typewriters when the 80s and 90s and foregone all that investment.
No, not at all. One of the big controversies about IT over the last 20 years has been, does it lead to productivity gains? And I think recent studies have shown pretty conclusively that in the right circumstances, it does lead to productivity gains, and even often very significant ones. But I think the question now, the more interesting question, is what happens to those productivity gains? Do they fall to an individual company's bottom line and stay there, or are they rapidly competed away and end up in customers' pockets? And that's the question I set out, to try to answer. And one of the things I found immediately is that it's important to draw a distinction between two very different types of technology that are used in business. On the one hand, you have proprietary technology. That's technology that an individual company can own, either outright or through an exclusive license, for instance. And proprietary technology can provide a very strong basis for competitive advantage that can last for quite a long time. But there's another category of business technology, which I call infrastructural technology. And infrastructural technology gives its greatest value only when it's broadly shared, broadly standardized, broadly homogenized. In other words, when it loses its ability to set one company apart from the pack. And I think IT fits into that category, that it's an infrastructural technology rather than a proprietary one.
So you're not saying there's no advantage. There's clearly a productivity advantage, but just don't be fooled by the strategic advantage.
Right. I mean, a company can manage that resource better than another company, certainly.
Right.
But to think you're going to innovate your way to a lasting or even meaningful advantage is usually a case of you fooling yourself.
Nick, are vendors getting the message? I mean, you talk about in the book something called you call overshooting, continuously adding features and functionality that maybe aren't necessary. But don't those features and functionality give companies competitive advantages?
Excuse me. I think it's less and less over time as the technology advances. I think there's been an assumption among at least some in the IT business that if we build it, they will use it.
Right.
That may have been true once, but I don't think it's true anymore. And the reason why is the phenomenon of overshooting. Mm-hmm. This is a term that was introduced by Clayton Christensen in his book, The Innovator's Dilemma. And what it says simply is that in any technology market, there are huge incentives for vendors to push out the cutting edge, to push the envelope, and push it very, very quickly. That's where their biggest margins are. That's where their most demanding customers are. But as that happens, as the envelope gets further and further out there, it starts to overshoot the needs of customers. And at first, it's a small segment of customers that are overshot, but then that grows and grows and grows. A good example that everybody can relate to is digital cameras on the consumer side. A couple of years ago when manufacturers went from 0.5 megapixel to 1 megapixel, that meant a huge deal to almost every user of digital cameras. That was valuable to everyone. Today, when we're going from 6 to 8 megapixels or 8 to 10, For most users, for most customers, it's meaningless. They're never going to use that additional dose of technology. It still means something to a small segment, but that segment is shrinking all the time. The same thing happens, I think, on the business side. In hardware, whether it's moving to the latest upgrade of a chip for your PCs, or going from version 6 to 7 of some enterprise application, more and more companies see diminishing returns. The costs of moving ahead start to overwhelm the benefits, and as a result, they start to peel back from the cutting edge, looking for cheaper, more generic, more standardized solutions, and all of that pushes the commoditization trend to continue and to even intensify.
You talk, Nick, about commoditizing, and you mentioned hardware. Digital cameras, I guess routers have become commoditized. What about software? Does software also have that same commoditizing curve?
I think it does. There's a romantic conception of software that says software is an emanation of human creativity or human intelligence.
Like
and that leads you to believe, how could this possibly commoditize? You can't commoditize human creativity or intelligence. And there's certainly truth to that. There are no natural constraints on software innovation. But I think it distorts the way software is actually used by businesses. When a business goes out to buy or make a piece of software, it's not going out on some open-ended creative exercise. It can define the functionality it wants quite clearly, one hopes, and measure how well the functionality is being delivered.
It's to solve a specific problem,
and so,
well-known problem.
Right. Yeah. Just like you'd buy a piece of hardware. Right. And so at that level, software is very much a product and very much subject to the same forces of commoditization that we've seen with hardware. In fact, there's one characteristic of software that I think makes it particularly susceptible to commoditization, and that's the huge economies of scale in software production. Very, very expensive to create the first number one model of the software, extremely cheap to reproduce it and distribute it. And I think the whole history of business software can be explained as an ongoing attempt to more fully realize those inherent economies of scale. In other words, to spread a piece of software as widely as possible among the companies in an industry, to standardize and homogenize the software. And whether it's going from outside suppliers of software to packaged software to now software as a utility service, everything we've seen in the evolution of software is another step ahead in commoditization.
Well, it actually raises an interesting question. Let me give it to you, Nick. Are you saying that companies should cut their IT spending, or they should get more bang for the buck, more for what they spend? Which is it?
I'm saying both. I think they should cut their IT spending and get more for what they're spending, and I think that's possible now. I think we've reached a turning point in the history of IT, in the management of IT, where companies can get more for less. And let me go over a few of the trends that I'm seeing in IT management today. I think companies now are moving to a bias to spend less year after year on IT. And that makes quite a dramatic change from the last 30, 40 years, where most companies took it for granted that they'd spend more year after year.
Yeah.
And now, I don't think that's any longer the assumption. There are going to be some times when it makes sense to spend more, but the bias, I think, has changed to spend less. Mm-hmm. I think we're also seeing a retreat from the cutting edge for the overshooting reasons that I talked about earlier. And companies are looking for cheaper solutions, cheaper hardware, cheaper software, open source software, are resisting the upgrade cycle, which is the third one here. Some new research shows that I think about 70% of companies want to slow down the upgrade cycle and express frustration with ongoing annual maintenance costs. And about 20% say we're done. Good enough is good enough. We don't want to upgrade anymore.
Also, if there's no value being on the cutting edge, why take the risk?
Right. It's always... In IT especially, it's always much more expensive to be on the cutting edge because prices for a given level of capability fall so quickly. I think those companies that are innovators are looking for more lower risk innovation. How can we avoid the high costs that traditionally go with IT innovation, or shift some of those costs to our partners, the way Walmart's doing with RFID, shifting the costs out to its suppliers. And finally, in the overarching theme, I think, is that companies are shifting their focus away from opportunities for advantage toward more remedying the vulnerabilities inherent in IT, whether it's spending too much, whether it's project failure, whether it's security issues. I mean, that's the new focus for IT management, I think.
Nick, what are your thoughts? What advice do you have for organizations that are trying to show some value for their IT investments?
Well, I think I've kind of been the voice of negativity here so far, and that's become my typecast role, I'm afraid. But there's also an important silver lining in what's going on, and I think it's important to discuss that as well, because whenever you have a commoditization trend in a market, you also have a power shift. Power shifts from the vendor to the buyer. And I think increasingly what's going to distinguish really smart users of IT is their ability to capitalize on the commoditization trend. And we're seeing, a lot of companies are doing that already. One example, Verizon, the big telephone company, it's cut its IT spending, annual IT spending, from 6% of revenues, which is the industry average, down to 4%. A huge cut. And how? By capitalizing on commoditization, by moving toward more generic commodity hardware, open source software, doing some offshoring of software development, driving harder bargains with vendors. Other companies, GE, GM, both very, very strong users of technology, very strong CIOs, are also cutting their annual spending on IT and getting more. Right. Even tech leaders like Amazon and Google are increasingly moving toward cheaper, commoditized hardware and software to run their business. And you have to ask yourself, if Google doesn't have to be on the cutting edge, do we have to be on the cutting edge? And I think more and more companies will say no, and will actually do quite well in the new environment.